Before beginning any work, make certain that all lockout-tagout guidelines are met according to OSHA 29 CFR 1910.147. Adjusting the brake on the RoofTracker 3 requires removing 2 springs. Use this procedure to remove the springs from the brake assembly. This procedure consists of 7 basic steps. Disconnecting the brake cable, removing the fan cover, removing the fan, removing the brake assembly, removing 2 of the outer brake springs, adjusting the air gap of the brake, and reassembling all of the components. This procedure requires the following tools: a number 0 Phillips screwdriver, a number 3 Phillips screwdriver, a 1/4 inch flat blade screwdriver, a 3/8 inch drive ratchet, a 10 millimeter socket, a 5 millimeter hex bit socket, a 6 millimeter hex bit socket, a 12 millimeter wrench, a 14 millimeter wrench, needle nose pliers, diagonal or side cutting pliers, small locking pliers, a 16/1000th of an inch feeler gauge. If you do not have a 16/1000th of an inch feeler gauge, you can use 2 feeler gauges that equal 16/1000ths of an inch, a 10/1000th of an inch and a 6/1000th of an inch, for example. To access the brake cable connections, first remove the 4 screws on the electrical enclosure and remove the cover. Record the color of the wires connected to terminals 5 and 6. Loosen the screw terminals and remove the wires from terminals 5 and 6. Using a 14 millimeter wrench, loosen the strain relief nut on the outside of the enclosure. Leave the strain relief on the cable. To remove the fan cover, first remove the brake lever using a 12 millimeter wrench. There are 4 bolts holding the fan cover to the motor assembly. Use a 3/8 inch drive ratchet and a 10 millimeter socket to remove these 4 bolts. Use a pair of external snap ring pliers to remove the outer snap ring and slide the fan off of the shaft. Use the ratchet and 6 millimeter hex bit socket to remove the 3 bolts holding the brake to the motor assembly. Slide the brake off of the shaft. Removing the springs from the brake assembly will be easier if you move the brake to a stable work surface. The brake assembly should have 4 outer springs. Make sure that when removing springs, the 2 removed are across the brake assembly from each other. Note that if there are only 2 outer springs, do not remove the remaining springs. To access the springs, loosen the 2 adjustment bolts using the 5 millimeter hex bit socket until the plate is even with the shoulders of the hollow bolts. Use the flat blade screwdriver or needle nose pliers to work the tip of the spring into the opening. Once you can see the end of the spring, use the locking pliers to turn the spring counterclockwise until it is free of the brake assembly. Repeat the process to remove the second spring. Place a 16/1000th of an inch feeler gauge between the plate and the rest of the brake assembly and tighten the 2 adjusting screws evenly until the plate touches the feeler gauge, and slightly loosen each adjusting screw until the feeler gauge moves freely. Verify that the gap is even all the way around the brake assembly. Assembly is the reverse of disassembly. It is important to note, however, that the brake must be oriented so that the brake lever bail is pointed towards the side with the electrical enclosure. Secure the brake to the motor by inserting the 3 6 millimeter socket head bolts. Tighten all 3 bolts with the ratchet and 6 millimeter hex bit socket. Align the keyway on the fan with the key on the shaft and slide the fan into position. Reinstall the snap ring to secure the fan. Secure the cable to the motor heatsink fin using a cable tie. Note the mark on the cable where the previous cable tie was. Use this to position the cable. Reinstall the fan cover with the opening pointing towards the side of the motor with the electrical enclosure. Secure the fan cover with the 4 bolts. Tighten all 4 bolts using the ratchet and a 10mm socket. Reinstall the brake lever. Tighten the brake lever using the 12mm wrench. Route the cable into the electrical enclosure. Use the paint mark on the cable as a guide. Tighten the strain relief nut using the 14mm wrench. Reconnect the wires to the number 5 and 6 screw terminals. Tighten the screw terminals using the 0 Phillips screwdriver. Reinstall the electrical enclosure cover and secure with 4 screws. This concludes the brake adjustment procedure. Remove all tools from the RoofTracker 3. Remove all lockouts and/or tagouts.